Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth and final session of Spirit, the stimulating program initiative for retirees that inspires thought. I'm Judy Steinig, Rebbitzin of the Young Israel of Bayside and Associate Director, Community Services of the Orthodox Union. And it's a pleasure to see all of you. Many of you I've been seeing at every program, so I hope that you've all been enjoying. This program is an initiative of the Orthodox Union, STAJE, OHEL, and the Young Israel of Woodmere. And we're so happy to be here and to have such a nice crowd considering the horrible weather outside. This program, as I've mentioned before, has been presented, it started this year in November, and we presented it in Teaneck. Then we moved over in the middle of a horrible winter to Boynton Beach in Boca. It was really nice to be there when the weather was bad here. And now we are happy to have done it in Woodmere. And we're looking for other venues, so if you're from other communities, please tell your rabbi, tell your president, tell friends of yours in other areas, because we think this is a program that's important all over the country. And we're looking for other topics. A few people came over to me during registration and mentioned a few other areas that they'd be interested in hearing about. We encourage you in your evaluation forms that we'll be handing out during the break between the two sessions. Please tell us other topics that you'd like to hear. We are very, very happy to work on other types of programs. There are other things that we're already thinking about, but I'm sure that you have other ideas. And at this point, it's my pleasure to call upon Harriet Cabelly, who is an LCSW. Her bio, I'm not going to spend time on it now. There are bio sheets on every table, and you can hear about both of our speakers who have very illustrious resumes. Harriet will speak on retire and reinvent, learn, grow, and explore new interests.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out in this rainy weather, but as I say, we had a gorgeous weekend, so it's the flowers and the trees and the grasses' turn to have their food, right? So if we put a positive spin on it, we won't be so grumpy about the rain. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself, but beyond what's in the resume. First of all, as I stand here before you today, this is my reinvention. I am reinventing myself by doing a public presentation. And I've been doing similar presentations like this since I retired, a word I don't like, but I'll get into that after. 3 years ago, I retired from the Board of Education. I was an early childhood social worker there for 20 years. I left, or I like to call, I moved on, so that I could grow my private practice, where I see clients one-on-one. I work with people who are overcoming different adversities and personal challenges, losses, and I help them rebuild their lives and grow beyond their problems with meaning and joy. But the reinvention for me kind of evolved because I was the shy little kid in school who never even wanted to raise their hand to answer a question, let alone ask a question, answer a question, and the feedback from my teachers to my mother at parent-teacher conferences was always, she doesn't say a word, she's very shy. And you know, you kind of have that image of yourself as you grow, so I always thought of myself as shy. But when I started having to do presentations, just because it was a part of my job at the Board of Ed, and I worked with groups, I thought, this isn't bad, I like the stimulation. So once I retired, I started getting asked to do presentations in different places, different venues, and I realized even though it's a bit nerve-wracking, it's kind of fun. Gets those endorphins going, and maybe you actually make a difference with your message. So here I am, but if you would have told me this 10 years ago, I would have said you're crazy. My comfort zone is a one-on-one. But we stretch ourselves, so we do get beyond, which is something that I'm going to speak about today. And I just want to say also in the bio, positive psychology. In fact, a person came over to me earlier and asked about it. I recently did an 11-month course in positive psychology with a person named Tal Ben Shachar, and I'm going to quote from him in my presentation, and it was a true gift that I gave to myself. Positive psychology, in case you're interested, is a branch off of psychology that instead of only focusing on the problems, but also focuses on the good, what's working well, what's going well, what are our strengths, because no matter what difficulties we're going through, and we also have the good, the strengths, and the tools. So that's really just a slight hint of what positive psychology is. My friends and family often ask why I'm working harder now, seemingly harder now than before. And I'm not alone in my new exciting developments. Besides being a type A personality, and I'm always looking for things and I take things on and I'm always busy, the truth is that the fastest and largest growing group of entrepreneurs today is the over age 55 group. The over age 55 people are leaving their jobs and they're looking to start new things because life isn't over at that point. In fact, we're in what's being called a longevity revolution, or an aging boom, where we're living an average of 34 years more than our great-grandparents, which means we've got a whole second adult life added to our life. We're spending a lot more time in this retirement phase. So are we prepared for a retirement of potentially 30 years? That's a long time. And I don't know if you like the word retirement. I personally don't, but we'll talk about that also. So we could look at retirement a bit differently, knowing that we've got years of it. And instead of looking at it as kind of a hanging out period, we can look at it more as a renewal period. What does our current life model look like? Well, basically there's three phases. The first is our education. We're kids, we're teenagers, we're adults, we go to school, that's our job, right? We tell our kids your job is to go to school, that's your work. We go to college, post-college, we develop into our professions. The second phase is productivity, right? We're taking on our jobs, we're trying to grow our career, we're having a family, we're raising kids, some of us, we're in a relationship, we're juggling work and home, and we're striving, we're climbing. And then the third phase is the retirement phase, which, as it's been viewed, is one of rest, leisure, enjoyment, hopefully enjoyment, right? Getting to finally do some of the things we want to do. This is a very age-segregated model, however, where culturally as a whole, there's been very little blending of those three phases. Now that this third act is lasting that much longer, from about age 60 to 90, obviously generally, we have a lot more opportunities and chances. So there's more integration and there's more overlap. People are starting second careers, third careers, they're possibly working their other jobs longer. People are going back to school. People are taking on new hobbies, developing new interests. I mean, there's a whole world out there to begin to say, hey, wait a second, this is not just about hanging. So we want to make sure our lives in this unexpected overtime is wonderful and worthwhile. So how will we use this time? How will we live it successfully? And by success here, I mean with enthusiasm, with engagement, with activity, with interest. So there's two paradigms I want to share with you. First of all, we have to get rid of the old metaphor where aging is known as the arch. So if you can picture an arch, right? We ascend, let's say the first phase of our life, we're learning, we're ascending, we're climbing, we're peaking, perhaps at the top of our career, our kids are grown, right? We're on top of the world, we were productive, successful, hopefully, and then we start on a decline in the third phase. We start on that decline. In this model, age is seen as pathology, and retirement is, like I said, kind of hanging out in that downward curve. It doesn't bring for such joy and optimism when we look at it like that. The new metaphor or paradigm, which was created by a late Harvard professor named Rudolf Arnheim, he puts out the visual of the staircase. And the staircase is going up. Now we could all say going up in our later years when we're zerkrachen, when maybe our knees, our legs don't work so well, we're weaker. Why would we have that visual of a staircase going up, of an ascension? Because it's the ascension of the human spirit. It's not the ascension necessarily of the body, because it's evolving in ways that are within us, our wisdom, our perspective, our wholeness. That's what we're looking to evolve and ascend. Here, age is seen as potential, because while we're all still alive and on this earth, we've got tremendous potential to actualize at any age. It's ageless, because the fact is, as human beings, we use very, very little of our potential, very little. So we've got tremendous more strengths and gifts that are within us that we can actualize. But we want to have this model that we still can do it, even though there may be challenges. So a beautiful example of this ascension is portrayed by a man named Neil Selinger, a 57-year-old retired lawyer. He loved writing, and when he retired, he figured he would go back to school to get a degree from Sarah Lawrence in writing, creative writing, and he did it as a hobby. Unfortunately, 2 years after retirement, he developed ALS, known as Lou Gehrig's disease. But just listen to what he wrote. And I quote, "As my muscles weakened, my writing became stronger. As I slowly lost my speech, I gained my voice. As I diminished, I grew. As I lost so much, I finally started to find myself." Now, he epitomizes this upward ascension of the staircase, because the growth of the human spirit is remarkable, barring all handicaps and disabilities. We are all capable of continued growth. So how do we open ourselves up to this new way of viewing our extended or our prolonged adulthood? We need to consciously think of what kind of a person or an older person we want to be. So I put out four points here to touch on. It takes intentionality. Do we want to be like driftwood, just floating aimlessly along? Or do we want to be creators of our lives at any point in time, bringing in what we value, what resonates for us, what's meaningful, what makes us come alive? What brings us that joy? It takes a mindset that's open to new ideas, new experiences. You know the saying, the world is our oyster? That's not just reserved for the college graduates, because I know at graduations or in cards, a lot of times that quote is put in. It's open to us as well, if we view it that way. There's a researcher from Stanford University named Carol Dweck, and she recently coined the term, the growth mindset. We want to take on a growth mindset where it's limitless, as opposed to the fixed mindset, which basically says what we're born with, our IQ, our talents, our abilities, is what we have throughout our life. And there's very little development beyond what we're God-given. And this person, Carol Dweck, in research, she's done tremendous research showing that's just not so. There's research being done in the brain, neuroplasticity, how many new neurons, new rewiring can be done in the brain when we give ourselves more input and richness in our lives, both physically and mentally. Now, you all know the expression, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I don't know how many buy into that. Anybody buy into that expression, that myth? You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Yes, you buy into it?
To some degree.
To some degree, okay.
It's more difficult to learn new tricks.
More difficult, okay. But more difficult doesn't take away the possibility, right? Things are more difficult. That doesn't mean we can't do it. It doesn't mean we can't do small bits and pieces of it, right, with effort. So I look at it and say it's a total myth. Holding on to this attitude, this myth, this quote, keeps us stuck in our sameness and doesn't allow for expansion. It keeps us just where we are. Oh, I can't do it. I can't do it. And can't is not a word that we should have in our vocabulary. We can't have the word can't. If I maintain my position that I can't do technology, because for me that is difficult and it's my weak link, I would never have done a website. I would never have done a blog, which I have an active blog. I think it's listed on my bio. And I'm proud of that. Now, did I do it myself? Of course not. It's not my forte. I had to hire the geeks to do it. But the point is, I'm not born into this new language. None of us are. Babies are. My 2-year-old granddaughter uses her thumb and just flips through that iPhone, which I don't even have yet. It's just incredible. But for us, it's a new language. It's like learning Greek. So I would have to, show my vulnerability to my web designer and say, listen, you got to talk slow. You got to talk basic. I don't get your language. Bear with me. And I have to have patience with myself. Even with myself, I get frustrated. I want to learn quicker. But this is new for us. So we need to give ourselves the patience. So yeah, like this gentleman said, it takes longer. It may be slower. So what? I'm proud. I'm learning it. I'm beyond where I was a year ago. My next goal is to do PowerPoint. Maybe if I ever come again, I'll have a PowerPoint. That's my summer goal, is to learn how to do PowerPoint. Right now, when I do presentations, my colleague does the PowerPoint. I do the material, she does the PowerPoint. We now need 2 things for presentations. That's a lot. So think about some of the new things you'd want to learn and take on. And then the 4th thing here I want to mention is curiosity. It takes curiosity to keep us engaged and interested and involved. Now that's an attribute that we could look at and say, gee, not everyone is curious. My husband doesn't consider himself a curious person. It's something that can be developed. In fact, we can develop most things that we want. Again, not to a great extent. I'm a type A personality. I'm never going to become like Mr. Rogers. I'm never going to become a type B. We can't make monumental changes in our essence, but we could do small things to bring more in of what we want. So curiosity opens us up to learning. You're curious about something. You want to learn about something. We don't know it all. If we ever know it all, then I don't really know what we're doing here. We're continuing to learn as long as we continue to breathe in whatever state we're at. So this curiosity is a wonderful thing to take on. It keeps us from being stale and boring. And there's so much out there in this world to be curious about. So what does reinventing mean? Which is the partial name of our speech. It means to make changes or improvements in ourselves, to present ourselves in a different or new way, such as I'm presenting myself in a way that, like I said, if you would have told me I'd be doing this 10 years ago, I would have said, you're nuts. I'm not standing in front of people talking. I'll do the one-on-one. So it looks different to each one of us. We can reconnect and rediscover our old passions, things we put on the back burner when we were going through that phase 2 of productivity, of family and career and job. We didn't have time then. Life got in the way, so to speak. Who had time to do the stuff necessarily that we wanted to do? But now, in the retirement phase, our obligations and intense stressors have hopefully lessened, and we have these new years to resume our interests. My mother-in-law, in her late 70s, early 80s, started taking oil painting classes. Now, she was always into crafts, and when her kids were young, she knitted and crocheted, but never did anything beyond that, and always was interested in the actual painting. So after they sold their store, and years later, and she said, what am I going to do? And it was suggested to her, but Claire, you always loved art. Why don't you start to draw? And P.S., she went back and took painting classes, and for the next 5 years, until she died, she did painting, and she gave, every time a new grandchild was born, she presented that family with a piece of artwork. I have many pieces in my home, and it gave her a renewed sense of life. I mean, you saw on her face the glow, because she was reinvesting in something that brought her tremendous joy, and she had a wonderful outlet. In other words, we all are creative beings. We need to keep doing and being productive and creative. She was being creative in something that she hadn't done in 60 years. So we can all go back and return to things that we've loved. I recently had a client in his mid-60s, again, a little bit lost, and we're going to talk about what it feels like to be lost sometimes after we retire. And he didn't know what he wanted to do. So putting aside that piece, we turned to looking at things that he likes. And he spoke about how when he was a teenager and young adult, he used to love music and play guitar. But in 40 years, he hadn't picked up a guitar or anything. So, of course, you know the end of that story. He eventually got a guitar, started playing, formed a little band, and got gigs in nursing homes, in senior homes. He went around to some coffee houses on Long Island. Again, he came alive again. So looking for new work at that point was put on the back burner because this became his raison d'etre. He just got so inspired with this, and this took off for him. So we need to see what was burning in us from years back, and can we have some of that back in our life? Now, it doesn't have to be that way. That's one way, reconnecting. How about looking for meaning and purpose? You know, we say that that's something that teenagers do, or young adults, like when they go through their identity crisis. What's my purpose? What am I doing here, right? But in truth, this is a theme throughout our lives. We all want to have purpose. We all need to find meaning because that's what gets us up in the morning, and that's what keeps us, again, engaged, that we feel like we're doing something worthwhile. Oftentimes, retirement brings about a loss. You know, we had an identity connected with what we did. A lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, a business person, a teacher. Someone would say, what do you do? I'm a teacher. What do you do was synonymous with who are you? It's really not who you are. It's really what you do. But that becomes synonymous. What you do becomes who you are. So when people retire, they lose that. They lose that. And that's got to be rediscovered. And sometimes people get depressed, and sometimes people go into a funk over that. But then we have to draw on our skills and our strengths and see what's there, because it's all there. We have it. But sometimes we need help tapping into it. So people go out, they do service, they volunteer. You do what you dig deep to see what's meaningful for you. So just to give a personal story here, my middle daughter had a very serious illness about 10 years ago. She survived, but it was very, very serious. She was in the hospital for a year. And she has her full life back from it, miraculously. And when this was behind us, I was a bit in angst because I said, what am I going to do with this miracle? I mean, her life hung by a thin thread. I need to do something. I need to find something new here. I can't just go back to my school job. It didn't seem like it respected the awesomeness of the miracle. So I did various things, not to go into that, but there was one thing that I just want to relay that became on my top 10 hit list of my life till this point. And that was my husband and I were puppy raisers. We were foster parents to a puppy who was to be trained to work with the disabled. We had found out about it various ways, and we signed on for it, and it was extremely difficult. We had him for 19 months. Numerous times we were ready to send him back, but it became very rewarding work. First of all, it encompassed just what resonated for me, my values. I didn't mention before, this daughter who had been sick has disabilities. And in fact, she lives next door in the Base Ezra group home. So she has disabilities, so it was close to my heart to work for an organization that's going to promote independence through a dog for people with disabilities. I always loved dogs, and as a kid I could never have one because my mother hated dogs and said, if you ever have a dog, I'm never coming into your house. Of course, the only shoe that this dog ever ate was when my mother did come in, and he ate her shoe. So he probably had the feelings in the house that this person doesn't like me. It is ironic, true story. So there was such purpose in this work that's really what got us through keeping this dog through the immense training. We had a manual, yay big, follow all the rules, but that purpose of, wow, if he passes and he gets sent to work with someone, how incredible that is, how meaningful. So in the end, he passed all his tests, and we had a graduation at Crest Hollow Country Club, and we walked him up on stage like you'd walk like a chassan kala walks up, turned his leash over to a 10-year-old little boy with cerebral palsy. And he went and he lived out, the dog went and lived out his mission, because they breed these dogs out in California to do this kind of work, along with this little boy. It was just incredible. And the interesting thing is, most of the people who take on this job of raising the dogs, not all but most, are people retired. And there are people who take on 5, 6, 7 dogs and do this. They finish one, they take in another. Not every dog passes. Some go on and work in the police department, some get adopted, but very meaningful work. Just a small example, because I was on my search looking. What can I do? How do I give back in awe of this miracle of my daughter? So we can always set new goals, new dreams, obviously age notwithstanding. And in fact, we should keep a goal list or a bucket list so that we stay involved and always looking forward. You know, we need to live in the present and revel in the moment so it doesn't pass us by, and be aware. But we need to know that there's a future, and that, I mean, we're not guaranteed it, but in our minds and in our souls to know that we're planning for something, because that keeps us going. So there's something I do often. It's not my idea, but I got it from my positive psychology professor. We make a love list, or we call it happiness boosters. It's a great way to just get in touch with things that we love, that resonate for us. We know it up here. We could, each of us, rattle off 5, 10 things. But when you start writing, first of all, there's something that happens between the brain and the hand, and it goes in more. It's very therapeutic. That's why journaling is so popular today. To actually take pen and paper and write down, you could come up with 100 things. I love purple. I love the smell of lavender. I love books. Whatever it is, as small as you think. Because again, when we start to bring in small pieces of what we love, small pieces of things that give us enjoyment, our lives get rich. And we may not be able to do the big thing. You know, if I like taking pictures, I'm not going to become a photographer. I may take a class, but I may just go out and shoot pictures on my own and then blow them up, which I have in my den. And when I sit in my den on Shabbos and I look at my blown up pictures of where I've been, I feel good. It just brings me joy. When I smell my lavender near my bed, it makes me go to sleep in a little bit of a different way. I try to push out the issues of the day, and I just breathe in the lavender. Sounds silly, sounds simplistic, very, very powerful. Small things can make a huge difference. The philosopher Voltaire, one of my favorite quotes, says, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." In other words, just because we can't do the whole thing, like I'm not going to become a photographer, or you're not going to go out and sign on to become a doctor now at this point, but we could still do smaller things, right? I could still take the pictures on my own. If I'm interested in medicine, I could read up. I could do some health coaching. We could do small things make a big difference. So we need to ask ourselves, what will I regret not having done? What will I regret not having done? Because the answer to this question can bring us closer to really what we want to do. And again, doing it in small parts makes a big difference. What I want to do is I want to eventually write my book. But I don't want to put it off too much, but when I ask myself that question, that's the answer that comes to mind. And I'm working on my procrastination so that I can start. Let's look a bit at the genetics part of our lives and how that impacts how we live. There's a researcher, Sonia Lubomirsky, out in California. She created what's called a happiness pie. And she says that 50% of our well-being is determined by genetics. Okay, that's big, right? That's half. 10% by circumstance, which I would have thought is much more. But 40% is determined by what we do in our lives, by our intentional activities, by what we bring. Now, there's some other people who say a little different percentage. They say 1/3 is genetics, 2/3 is what we do. Doesn't matter exactly. The point being, that's a lot in our power to be doing for ourselves, and not just leave it to, resign myself to, well, I'm just genetically like that. There's nothing I can do about it. There's almost half that we can do. And I quote, "Genetics may deal you certain cards, but you choose how to play them." My husband's father and grandfather both died in their early 60s of heart disease. My husband recently turned 60, but this year was a pretty hard year for him and for me because he experienced tremendous anxiety about this turning 60. Now, it's a big deal to turn 60 in general, but his anxiety revolved more around the fact of, is he going to be here? Or is he going to have the fate of his father and grandfather? So his cardiologist had told, who he was going to for slight issues, not major things, told him, you know, the best thing to do besides your medicine is just to start being proactive and exercise. Don't just sit back. Exercise, start drinking your red wine, start cutting out some of the junk you're eating, which is what he did over the last couple of years. So again, we could live with the expectation that that's going to happen to us and become a victim to it and do nothing, or we could take what's in our control and do something about it. I love this quote. Our predisposition is not necessarily a doomed prediction. Our predisposition, what we're predisposed to genetically, is not necessarily, we're not doomed for it. It's not necessarily a prediction. Again, we come back to it's our mindset. Are we going to succumb to what we think is our fate and take on that victim-like mentality? Or are we going to take control and live our life on purpose, with intention? We're the players in our life, and we can do a lot. Obviously, Hashem is the main player, but we have to do what's in our control to help ourselves along. Now, here's something else that's interesting. This goes contrary to what we all assume, certainly to what I assumed. Public researchers found that in retirement phase, the overall mental health of people is the most stable and positive in this time period. Now, I would have thought, as I'm sure many of you would have thought, that it's the opposite because there's more loneliness and illness and death and, you know, what am I going to do with myself after I retire, angst. But it's showing the opposite. Less stress, less competition, less angst, more acceptance of life's ups and downs, because I'm sure we've all been through stuff, greater perspective and wisdom. And these all contribute to a higher level of well-being and satisfaction. That's not to say that there isn't sadness and that there isn't some depression, especially during transition times and during loss, and that the state of flux can be very unsettling, but we have to hold on and know that this too shall pass. We've maybe been down this road before, we have the inner resources, and we can carve out new pathways. And we have to give ourselves permission to be human, to feel what we go through, that it's okay. It's okay. A lot of this is normal stuff. But in general, I just think this was so interesting. In general, the over 65ers are happier than the 20-somethings. Because we've been there, maybe, because there's more of an at peace, whereas those 20-somethings, ooh, they're fighting, right? Looking to climb, competing, worrying about what everyone else is thinking, right? How much do we worry what anyone thinks anymore? When I decided that I didn't care, I went and I painted my front door purple. This was a few years ago. At that time, I'm an empty nester. My kids are grown out of the house. But at that time, my youngest daughter was home, and it was like she was so embarrassed. Oh, Ma. I mean, she was 19, but it was like, I'm so embarrassed that we're the only one in the neighborhood with a purple door. So what? My house. You have your house, you won't have a purple door. But it became where we don't care anymore, right? It's like, okay, we accept ourselves more. We're willing to take chances. Who cares what people think at this point, right? Sometimes. But a lot of that is let go. And then it just feels better. So that's, I guess, tied in with that, the mental health being at an overall higher level. We hopefully have realized by now that much of our life and the quality of it is shaped by our attitude. Our lens of life, how we see things, determines how we live. There's a lot being done on the mind-body connection. I'm sure you know how our emotions have a direct effect on our physical health. So for a better quality of life and for a longer life, it behooves us to develop and maintain that positive attitude. Viktor Frankl, I'm sure you've heard, the Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, spent years in Auschwitz, wrote about his experiences there and what he learned about the meaning and purpose of suffering and of life in general. And he wrote it in one of the most life-transforming books. I'm sure you've heard of it, if not read it. And if you haven't read it, you have to read it, Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote powerfully on the ideas that responses to our circumstances are the key factor, not the circumstances themselves, but how we respond, which really goes back to that pie that said 10% of our well-being is based on circumstance. And I quote from him, This is a very popular quote. Everything you have in life can be taken from you except one thing: your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation. This is what determines the quality of the life we've lived. Not whether we've been rich or poor, famous or unknown, healthy or suffering. What determines our quality of life is how we relate to these realities, what kind of meaning we assign them, what kind of attitude we cling to about them, what state of mind we allow them to trigger. Because he wrote in this book how he would be with the inmates, the starving people and sick with tuberculosis. And even they, not all, would go and look to comfort other inmates. The sick and starving would look to comfort the other sick and starving, would sit by the bed, would stroke them, would give them their last piece of a crumb. What makes some able to do that? Some to be able to rise above circumstance? That's the all-time famous question. The good news is that we can develop and cultivate this more positive and optimistic attitude. We don't have to be stuck in the glass half empty mentality. I have a blog I think I mentioned. I just interviewed an ABC News reporter. He does Nightline, Dan Harris. And he said something interesting. He said, we spend a lot of time and money taking care of our bodies, our cars, and homes and pets. But we don't spend a lot of time taking care of the one filter through which we experience literally everything in our life, and that's our mind. We don't look to shape it and filter it and try to weed out what causes us angst and the toxicity that it brings in, right? Like, why do we all watch this horrible news? Why take all that in? So he in this regard, he was talking about the value of meditation. But we can exercise our mind so that we can build more positive muscle. And again, there's so much coming out of University of Pennsylvania on positive psychology that says we're not doomed to what we're born with. We can learn and bring in new ways of viewing life and of cultivating more optimism. And how? Just going to go over a couple. How do we do that? Again, some of this is going to sound simplistic, but it's not. It's difficult. We can become more of a benefit finder as opposed to a fault finder. It seems we're all preconditioned to be very quick to hone in on the negatives, the criticism, what's wrong, right? But we need to shift and change that channel so that we could start to see what's going right. There's a lot going right. And there's a cute way to remember, www, what went well. And there are a lot of teachers now who do this with their classes. We do this in counseling. So that, yeah, it's not negating the problems. Nobody's being Pollyanna-ish and thinking they're not there. But there's also the good. There's also what's working. So when someone loses a job, that's terrible, and it could have a domino effect. But if that person looks at what is going well, they're healthy, their family is healthy, they have a roof over their head, they have parents and grandparents in their lives. Yes, they lost a big thing, a job. And they also have the other things that are working well. A lot of us don't look at things like that. We look at it when we don't have something big in our life, then that's the whole cloud, then that's our whole life. We generalize it to everything. But when we begin to shift and say, let's look for the benefits, let's look for the good, we can begin to shift again. And we're not looking for major changes, small bits, going from a 1 to a 2. We don't have to go from a 1 to a 10. We're not making miraculous, humongous changes. We are who we are, but small things. And that creates an upward spiral when we start to be benefit finders. And this ties into it. My professor for positive psychology, Tal Ben Shachar, says, when you appreciate the good appreciates. Great quote. When you appreciate the good appreciates. When we can appreciate, then it grows, because we start to see more around us. And how do we do that? Now, we all know from prayers, from davening, that We are grateful. We express our gratitude all the time. But sometimes it becomes a little robot-like. Not always, but sometimes. And we want to do this consciously and purposefully. Now, there's an acute exercise. Again, it sounds silly, but it's very powerful. It's called the 3 blessings, where every night we write down 3 things that we're grateful for. And this really serves us well, especially when going through difficult times, because even when things are rough, like when my daughter was in the hospital for a year, and I'd walk my track, and I'd make a list, what am I grateful for? Because otherwise I was just drowning in horror of what was going on. And I'd say, thank God, she's in a great hospital. I didn't choose it. She went as an emergency. Thank God it's great. Thank God the doctors are great. Thank God the nurses are great. We do it as a coping skill. In other words, to really write down things and really consciously bring that gratitude into our head. And we also do it just as a way of bringing up our muscle of positivity that we have, because there's nothing more powerful than feeling gratitude and appreciation. The idea that things don't necessarily happen for the best, he says this also, Tal Ben Shachar, things don't necessarily happen for the best, but some people are able to make the best of things that happen. Now, we all know tons of people like that who can make lemonade out of lemons. Look at Christopher Reeves, right? When he fell off this horse and he was paralyzed for the rest of his life. Look at the difference he made for the Spinal Cord Injury Foundation for people, and he used only what was here because he couldn't use any other part of his body. People who lose children and yet go on and build foundations or help others. So it's again, not just circumstance, it's what we do with what we get, unfortunately, in life. And we can pull the silver lining from the clouds, and we can turn challenges into opportunities. And so in ending, I want to stress that the decision to make our life rich and rewarding in this phase is up to us. At every moment, we have a choice in how we're going to respond, in what we focus on, and in what we do. So let's recognize that and be creators. Be creators of our lives. We'll then live with and on purpose, and we'll have lives filled with meaning and joy, and maybe even live the best part of our lives right now. And I end with a quote by Maria Robinson. I guess you know I like quotes. Nobody can go back and start a new beginning, but anyone can start today and make a new ending. Thank you. So I have a handout. I give it to you at the end. It's a bunch of quotes and some really nice pictures. Hopefully they will be inspirational to you. And I printed them in color, so that looks even nicer. Sure, I can take questions.
I will be happy to handle that. Thank you so much. I think everybody enjoyed it. And you
I
inspired
hope
us
so.
to
I hope so. It speaks to me.
But if there are questions.
Questions, comments?
Harriet, I'm going to ask you to repeat the question as.
Oh, okay. If anybody, questions or feedback, agrees with things, disagree, doesn't have to be a question. Hi from West Hempstead.
Our society worships or idolizes youth.
Yes.
And if we know it, if it was a trend that came from Hollywood where all the actresses had to look younger, or the cosmetic industry that emphasizes beauty and youth. Now with the baby boomers that we are, our age, but
Right.
pretty big majority in our population, there is so little in literature or in newspapers that aside from AARP, we don't read about great people over 50 who contributed to society. Why isn't there an organization that can print? I mean, there are people who retire who can contribute to literary magazines.
Sure. Let's start it. Do you hear what she's saying? Did everyone hear? In other words, our society idolizes the youth. Hollywood pushes that. And why isn't there, I'm just summing it up, why isn't there more literature, more exposure for the wonderful things that the baby boomers are doing and contributing? Right. That's why we have these forums. First of all, we have to realize that it's doable.
But you need an organization to sponsor it. I'm sure there's something that can come across. But
Right. So right now, the main one is AARP, and there does need to be more. And listen, Anybody who loves to write, get editorials, get pieces in the newspapers. I mean, in Newsday, I know it's not the New York Times, but in section 2 of Newsday on Saturdays, I find there's always uplifting stories from the older generation. There needs to be more of that. I agree. Very good point. But it's up to us. We're the voice, aren't we? So we have to start doing it and getting that exposure out more. Yeah, another West Hempsteader. I'm from West Hempstead, so I'm just seeing some people. You forged ahead, you paved your way. Yes, but there is this stigma. I mean, it doesn't go away so fast that at a certain age, how come you're not retired? How come you're not retired? People aren't getting that we don't have to if we don't have to, and what if we like what we do? But that's a societal norm. Again, it's hard to buck the norms that are put out there. But when we start doing it and we walk our own path, we do. But it's hard.
Some people who stay on their jobs longer nowadays are getting criticized that you're hurting the job market for the youngsters who quit their job.
Right. As if they're the only ones who count, right? We count too. Yep. It's our society. It's very hard, but we have to work at it. That could be our goal. Any other comments or questions? Feedback? Well, that's what I was saying. We're living a lot longer.
And also, most of the people here are probably past the sandwich, but we got a lot of people who find themselves taking care of older parents and they're sandwiched between the youngsters.
The grandchildren now. The grandchildren and the elderly. Right. That's my situation.
Even if your parents are no longer here, you have children and grandchildren that you're trying to help out.
Right. Right. So you have to still get the time for you. You have to still put in the time for you. Like it's like, when do we have our time? Right? You got to make it. You got to put it in. It's not going to just happen. Yes. Interacting? So you're there, so now you can see it. So this gentleman is saying that when he was younger and he used to hear of older people retiring and playing golf, he'd say, oh, that's boring. What am I going to do? Now he's at that age and he's doing it and he likes it. You know, we have to sometimes get to there to be in our own shoes and feel it. It's easy to judge. Anyone else? Okay, thanks. Enjoy the next Rabbi Hanoch Teller. Orphans going, and maybe you actually make a difference with your message. So here I am, but if you would have told me this 10 years ago, I would have said you're crazy. My comfort zone is a one-on-one. But we stretch ourselves, so we do get beyond, which is something that I'm going to speak about today. And I just want to say also in the bio, positive psychology. In fact, a person came over to me earlier and asked about it. I recently did an 11-month course in positive psychology with a person named Tal Ben Shachar, and I'm going to quote from him in my presentation, and it was a true gift that I gave to myself. Positive psychology, in case you're interested, is a branch off of psychology that instead of only focusing on the problems, but also focuses on the good, what's working well, what's going well, what are our strengths. Because no matter what difficulties we're going through, and we also have the good, the strengths, and the tools. So that's really just a slight hint of what positive psychology is. My friends and family often ask why I'm working harder now, seemingly harder now than before. And I'm not alone in my new exciting developments. Besides being a type A personality, and I'm always looking for things, and I take things on, and I'm always busy. The truth is that the fastest and largest growing group of entrepreneurs today is the over age 55 group. The over age 55 people are leaving their jobs and they're looking to start new things because life isn't over at that point. In fact, we're in what's being called a longevity revolution, or an aging boom, where we're living an average of 34 years more than our great-grandparents, which means we've got a whole second adult life added to our life. We're spending a lot more time in this retirement phase. So are we prepared for a retirement of potentially 30 years? That's a long time. And I don't know if you like the word retirement. I personally don't, but we'll talk about that also. So we could look at retirement a bit differently, knowing that we've got years of it. And instead of looking at it as kind of a hanging out period, we can look at it more as a renewal period. What is our current life model?
Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth and final session of Spirit, the stimulating program initiative for retirees that inspires thought. I'm Judy Steinig, Rebbitzin of the Young Israel of Bayside and Associate Director, Community Services of the Orthodox Union. And it's a pleasure to see all of you. Many of you I've been seeing at every program, so I hope that you've all been enjoying. This program is an initiative of the Orthodox Union, STAJE, OHEL, and the Young Israel of Woodmere. And we're so happy to be here and to have such a nice crowd considering the horrible weather outside. This program, as I've mentioned before, has been presented, it started this year in November, and we presented it in Teaneck. Then we moved over in the middle of a horrible winter to Boynton Beach in Boca. It was really nice to be there when the weather was bad here. And now we are happy to have done it in Woodmere. And we're looking for other venues, so if you're from other communities, please tell your rabbi, tell your president, tell friends of yours in other areas, because we think this is a program that's important all over the country. And we're looking for other topics. A few people came over to me during registration and mentioned a few other areas that they'd be interested in hearing about. We encourage you in your evaluation forms that we'll be handing out during the break between the two sessions. Please tell us other topics that you'd like to hear. We are very, very happy to work on other types of programs. There are other things that we're already thinking about, but I'm sure that you have other ideas. And at this point, it's my pleasure to call upon Harriet Cabelly, who is an LCSW. Her bio, I'm not going to spend time on it now. There are bio sheets on every table, and you can hear about both of our speakers who have very illustrious resumes. Harriet will speak on retire and reinvent, learn, grow, and explore new interests.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out in this rainy weather, but as I say, we had a gorgeous weekend, so it's the flowers and the trees and the grasses' turn to have their food, right? So if we put a positive spin on it, we won't be so grumpy about the rain. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself, but beyond what's in the resume. First of all, as I stand here before you today, this is my reinvention. I am reinventing myself by doing a public presentation. And I've been doing similar presentations like this since I retired, a word I don't like, but I'll get into that after. 3 years ago, I retired from the Board of Education. I was an early childhood social worker there for 20 years. I left, or I like to call, I moved on, so that I could grow my private practice, where I see clients one-on-one. I work with people who are overcoming different adversities and personal challenges, losses, and I help them rebuild their lives and grow beyond their problems with meaning and joy. But the reinvention for me kind of evolved because I was the shy little kid in school who never even wanted to raise their hand to answer a question, let alone ask a question, answer a question, and the feedback from my teachers to my mother at parent-teacher conferences was always, she doesn't say a word, she's very shy. And you know, you kind of have that image of yourself as you grow, so I always thought of myself as shy. But when I started having to do presentations just because it was a part of my job at the Board of Ed, and I worked with groups, I thought, this isn't bad, I like the stimulation. So once I retired, I started getting asked to do presentations in different places, different venues, and I realized even though it's a bit nerve-wracking, it's kind of fun, gets those endorphins.